Complete story of the Book of Job, hidden prophecy revealed. What if suffering was never meant to destroy you, but to invite you into the deepest places of God's heart? What if the moments you feared were your undoing were actually the threshold to something greater, something eternal? In a world obsessed with ease and success, the story of Job stands alone, a blazing fire on a dark mountain, a testament that faith is not measured by prosperity, but by the anchor that holds when everything else falls away. Long before Moses received the law, long before kings ruled and prophets spoke, there lived a man in the distant land of Uz, a man without a covenant, without a temple, without a nation to call his own, but a man who knew God. Job was known for what few are ever praised for. He was blameless, a man who feared God and shunned evil, not because he was forced to, but because he loved righteousness for its own sake. Yet into the life of this righteous man, a challenge arose, a test not born from sin, but allowed by divine permission, witnessed by the hosts of heaven and the powers of darkness alike. The story of Job is not simply the story of loss. It is a revelation of the great unseen battle between appearance and reality, between what we see and what is unseen. And hidden within its ancient lines is a prophecy, a shadow of the one who would come to redeem suffering itself. Among all the books of Scripture, Job is unique. It offers no easy answers, no formulas, only the raw dialogue between a wounded man and a sovereign God, and the breathtaking realization that knowing God is better than understanding life. Today, you are invited into this journey, not as a distant observer, but as a participant, to walk through ashes, through questions, through silence, until, like Job, you no longer merely hear of God, but see Him. If this journey speaks to your heart, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or what God is revealing to you. Together we are building a place where the broken find hope, where questions lead to encounter, and where the voice of God is honored above the noise. You are not just watching a story, you are stepping into it. Father, as we walk through the mystery and fire of Job's story, open our eyes to see your beauty beyond the ashes. Anchor our hearts in your love that no storm can shake, and teach us to trust you even when the path is hidden from our sight. In Jesus' name, amen. Let the journey begin, the blameless man and the heavenly challenge. The Book of Job, Chapter 1. In the land of Uz, far beyond the borders of Israel's promised inheritance, there lived a man whose life was a quiet flame of devotion. His name was Job. He was not perfect, but he was blameless, a man who feared God with a sincerity rarely seen, who turned away from evil not to impress, but because his heart genuinely longed for the good. His life reflected the beauty of righteousness, wealth not corrupted by greed, family not idolized above God, blessings held with open hands. 7 sons and 3 daughters filled his home with laughter. Fields yielded abundant harvests. Herds multiplied under his careful stewardship. By every visible measure, Job was blessed beyond most men of his day. Yet, in the invisible realms, a conversation was taking place, one that Job could not hear, one that would change the course of his life forever. The scene shifts to the courts of heaven, where the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And among them was one who had long since turned against the throne, Satan, the accuser. The Lord spoke first, drawing attention to his servant. "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him, blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." But the accuser smiled with venom in his voice. Does Job fear God for nothing? He accused Job of loving God only because of the blessings, a transaction, not a relationship. "Stretch out your hand," he challenged, "and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." Permission was granted, but with one boundary. Satan could touch all that Job possessed, but not Job himself. And so, without warning, the storm descended. In a single, devastating day, messengers arrived, one after another, with breathless horror. The Sabaeans raided and stole the oxen and donkeys. Fire fell from heaven and consumed the sheep. The Chaldeans swept in and took the camels. And worst of all, a mighty wind struck the house where Job's sons and daughters were feasting. The building collapsed, and every child he loved was crushed beneath the ruins. Job rose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell to the ground. But not in rage, not in rebellion. He fell in worship. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. The heavenly courts had witnessed his response. The earth had felt the weight of his grief. But heaven had also heard the sound of a man whose worship was not a transaction, but a covenant sealed in suffering. What Satan believed would destroy faith instead revealed its truest form. Faith that needs no explanation. Faith that clings to God when every blessing is stripped away. Faith that stands not because life is good, but because God is. And the heavens took notice. The broken body and the silent friends. The book of Job, chapter 2. The courts of heaven opened once again. The sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and among them was Satan, the accuser, the adversary, the restless wanderer of the earth. The Lord spoke first, not in anger, but in confidence. Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him, blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without cause. But Satan, undeterred, pressed deeper. Skin for skin, he retorted. A man will give all he has for his own life. Stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face. Once again, permission was granted. The Lord set the boundary. Satan could afflict Job's body, but Job's life was to be preserved. And so the assault began. Not through armies or storms this time, but through the betrayal of Job's own flesh. Pain bloomed across his body like a fire untamed. Sores broke open across his skin, festering and raw, erupting from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Every movement was agony, every breath a labor. The man who once sat among princes now found himself seated among ashes. Ashes, the ancient sign of mourning, repentance, and human frailty. Ashes, whispering of mortality, of dreams reduced to dust. In his brokenness, Job reached for a shard of pottery, scraping at the corrupted flesh as if to find some relief or perhaps some meaning in the unbearable ruin of his body. And then came the voice from closest to his heart, his wife. No longer able to endure the sight of the man she once knew. "Are you still holding on to your integrity?" she cried. "Curse God and die." It was not merely a cry of despair. It was a cry of rebellion, a temptation whispered by pain, to turn suffering into bitterness, to let grief become a weapon against faith. But Job, though crushed in body and soul, answered her without rage. His voice, perhaps cracked and weary, still carried the weight of conviction. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. The heavens leaned in to listen. The wager of the unseen realms hung in the balance, and Job's worship, battered but unbroken, held fast. News of his affliction traveled far, and 3 men who had once been counted as his friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, came together, intending to mourn with him and to comfort him. But when they approached and saw him from a distance, they hardly recognized the figure that sat among the ashes. This was not the Job they had admired, the man of wisdom, strength, and wealth. This was a shadow of sorrow, a man whose appearance bore the marks of devastation. Overwhelmed, they raised their voices and wept aloud. They tore their robes, a sign of deep mourning, and cast dust upon their heads toward heaven, an act of solidarity with Job's humiliation, and a recognition that, before God, all men are but dust. And then, in an act of rare and sacred compassion, they sat down with him on the ground, saying nothing, not for a moment, not for an hour, but for 7 days and 7 nights, a full week of shared silence, for they saw that Job's suffering was too great for words. Sometimes there are wounds too deep for explanations. Sometimes the greatest ministry is not in speaking, but in weeping alongside the broken. In the silent ashes of Uz, heaven watched, the earth groaned, and a wounded man, untouched by easy answers, held on to the only thing left to him, his faith. And for now, it was enough. The cry of a shattered soul. The Book of Job, chapter 3. For 7 days and 7 nights, Job and his friends sat in unbroken silence. No words dared cross their lips, for the weight of suffering was too heavy, the grief too sacred for careless explanations. But silence cannot hold pain forever. At last, Job broke the stillness, and when he spoke, it was not with theological arguments or polite phrases. It was with the raw cry of a soul torn open by agony. "Cursed be the day of my birth," he cried. "Cursed the night that said, 'A boy is conceived.'" He did not curse God, but he cursed the very day that had brought him into existence. Job wished that the day of his birth had been blotted from the calendar, erased from history, sealed in darkness, and forgotten by time itself. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever wondered why your story even began, when pain seems to have the loudest voice? Why did I not perish at birth? Why were there knees to receive me and breasts that nursed me? Job looked back on life not as a blessing to be celebrated, but as a burden he wished had been avoided altogether. If death had come early, he reasoned, he would now be at rest, free from turmoil, free from the relentless gnawing of pain. He imagined death not as an enemy, but as a refuge, a place where kings and slaves alike find peace, where the oppressor and the oppressed lie side by side in silent equality. Can you imagine longing for rest so deeply that even the grave feels like mercy? Why is life given to those who long for death, to those who search for it more than hidden treasure? These are not the questions of a man who has lost faith, but of a man who refuses to pretend. Have you ever carried questions too heavy for easy answers? Questions you were too afraid to voice aloud? Job's words remind us that God does not fear our honesty. He does not silence the shattered soul. He listens, for the thing he feared most had come upon him. What he dreaded had overtaken him. There was no peace, no quietness, no rest, only turmoil. And yet, even in this turmoil, Job's cry became an offering. Sometimes the deepest worship is not found in declarations of triumph, but in daring to lay our brokenness at God's feet. Maybe you have been taught that God only wants your victories, but what if he treasures your honesty even more? Heaven did not turn away from Job's lament. Heaven leaned closer, and the journey into the mystery of suffering had truly begun. Eliphaz's accusation, "You must have sinned." The Book of Job, chapter 4. The silence that had wrapped itself around the ashes of Uz finally broke. For 7 days, no one had dared to speak. For 7 nights, the weight of grief had pressed them all into solemn quiet. But Job's cry, raw, bitter, unfiltered, stirred something in his friends, and Eliphaz the Temanite was the first to answer. At first he spoke gently, cloaking his words in concern. "If someone ventures a word with you, will you be impatient?" he asked. "But who can keep from speaking?" He reminded Job of his past righteousness, how Job had instructed many, strengthened feeble hands, supported those who stumbled, and encouraged the weary. But then Eliphaz's tone shifted. "Now trouble comes to you," he said, "and you are discouraged. It strikes you and you are dismayed." Was this sympathy or accusation veiled in soft words? Consider now, who that was innocent ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? It was a dangerous suggestion. Eliphaz implied that suffering was a result of sin, that Job's calamity could not be without cause. Have you ever encountered friends like this? those who mean well, yet speak words that pierce deeper than any wound. Eliphaz shared a vision, a mystical, unsettling dream he had received, a spirit gliding past his face, bringing a whisper of fearful revelation. Can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his Maker? The insinuation was clear. Job, no matter how upright he appeared, must have fallen short. It is easy to judge when we stand outside the fire. It is easy to explain suffering when it is not our own. Have you ever been crushed, not just by pain, but by the careless words of those who thought they understood your story? Eliphaz's theology was simple. Good things happen to good people. Bad things happen to bad people. Therefore, Job's suffering must be deserved. But is life really that mechanical? Does righteousness guarantee comfort and sin guarantee ruin without exception? Eliphaz's words remind us how dangerous half-truths can be. In a broken world, suffering does not always fit neatly into human explanations, and sometimes those who suffer most are those closest to the heart of God. Job, still sitting among the ashes, heard his friend's words and knew that the battle he faced was not only with grief, but now with the weight of accusation as well. The wounds of pain run deep, but the wounds of betrayal, even from well-meaning friends, cut even deeper. The journey had shifted. The trial was no longer just physical. It was now a battle for Job's very soul. Eliphaz's counsel, seek God and prosper again. The book of Job, chapter 5. Eliphaz was not finished. After accusing Job, softly but surely, of hidden guilt, he now offered a solution. If I were you, he said, I would appeal to God. I would lay my cause before him. On the surface, his words seemed wise, even compassionate. Seek God. Present your case. Return to him. Isn't that what every suffering soul should do? But underneath the counsel lay a theology dangerously shallow. Repent, and your fortunes will be restored. Confess, and the blessings will return. Bow low enough, and prosperity will rise again. Have you ever heard advice like this? Advice that treats God like a cosmic vending machine, where obedience guarantees blessing and suffering always signals sin? Eliphaz painted a picture of God as one who wounds but also heals, who crushes but binds up again. He spoke of God's greatness in lofty terms. He performs wonders that cannot be fathomed, miracles that cannot be counted. He spoke of rain falling upon the earth, of justice for the oppressed, of the crafty being caught in their own schemes. At times his words shimmered with truth, for indeed God does bring justice. Indeed, he is the God of wonders. But in Eliphaz's view, the relationship was transactional. Suffering was proof of guilt. Restoration was proof of repentance, and Job, in his brokenness, stood judged by this simple equation. Have you ever found yourself crushed under the weight of expectations you could never meet? Have you ever wondered if pain meant that you had somehow failed God? Eliphaz concluded his speech with promises of earthly blessings. You will know that your tent is secure. You will come to the grave in full vigor, like sheaves gathered in season. In other words, come back to God, and all will be well again. But what if the path of the righteous sometimes leads not to immediate restoration, but to deeper transformation? What if faith is proven not when God blesses us outwardly, but when we cling to him, even when the blessings are stripped away? Eliphaz meant well, but his counsel was a reflection of human logic, not divine revelation. Job's battle was not against a God who had abandoned him, nor against his own hidden sins. It was against the mystery of suffering, a mystery far deeper than Eliphaz could comprehend. The easy answers would not heal Job's wounds. They would only deepen the loneliness of his grief. And in the ashes, Job would have to decide, would he defend himself? Would he abandon his integrity? Or would he wrestle with God himself, trusting that somewhere beyond the pain, there was still a hand that held him? Job's response: my suffering is beyond your wisdom. The book of Job, chapter 6. The words of Eliphaz hung heavy in the air. His tidy theology, his confident assumptions, had offered Job no comfort, only isolation. And now, for the first time, Job lifted his voice in reply. "If only my anguish could be weighed," he cried, "and all my misery be placed on the scales, it would outweigh the sand of the seas." That is why his words had been so reckless. Job was not speaking from theory. He was speaking from a soul submerged in suffering so vast, so relentless, that even his cries could not capture its weight. Have you ever carried pain so great that words seemed like dust in your mouth? Have you ever longed for someone to see the invisible burden you bear? Job rebuked his friends not because they spoke, but because they failed to offer what he most needed: compassion. He compared their loyalty to a dried-up brook, streams that vanish in the heat, disappointing the caravans that trusted them to sustain life in the desert. When suffering deepens, false comforts sting sharper than silence, and Job, broken and bewildered, now faced not only the loss of all he held dear, but the cold distance of those he once called friends. "Teach me," he pleaded, "and I will be quiet. Show me where I have been wrong." Job was willing to listen, willing to examine his life, but empty accusations offered no wisdom, only deeper wounds. He pointed out that the rebukes of his friends were like the tasteless white of an egg, nourishing no one, satisfying nothing. His heart, already crushed, found their words bitter and empty. He did not deny his pain. He did not pretend strength he did not have. He opened his wound to be seen, and in doing so taught a truth often forgotten. Suffering does not always demand correction. Sometimes it demands compassion. Sometimes the greatest ministry is not to analyze, but to simply sit with another soul and say, "I see you. I grieve with you." Job's cry was not a demand for sympathy alone. It was a longing for truth, for real, sacred understanding. In the ashes, under the weight of unseen agony, Job clung not to easy answers, but to the hope that somewhere beyond human wisdom, God still saw him. And that hope, though fragile, refused to die. Job's cry to God, "Why have you made me your target?" The book of Job, chapter 7. When the wounds inflicted by friends cut deeper than the sores on his skin, Job turned his voice away from men and lifted it toward heaven. No longer did he address Eliphaz or the others. Now his cry was aimed at the one who, in Job's eyes, had allowed this crushing weight to fall upon him. "Does not man have hard service on earth?" he asked. "Are not his days like those of a hired laborer?" To Job, life had become nothing more than endless toil, the bitter labor of surviving one sorrow after another, waiting for night to come, only to be haunted by restless dreams and unrelenting agony. Have you ever lived through nights so long that even sleep feels like an enemy? "My body is clothed with worms and scabs," Job lamented. "My skin is broken and festering." His physical torment was unbearable, but even deeper was the torment of his soul. "My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle," he cried, "and they come to an end without hope." To Job, life was unraveling at a speed he could not control. Hope, once steady in his soul, now seemed like a distant memory. He turned his questions toward God with brutal honesty. "What is mankind, that you make so much of them, that you give them so much attention, that you examine them every morning and test them every moment?" It was a reversal of the psalmist's awe. Where David marveled in worship, Job marveled in confusion. Why would God set his gaze upon a fragile creature only to crush him under the unbearable weight of sorrow? "Will you never look away from me, or let me alone even for an instant?" Job was not challenging God's existence. He was questioning his heart. What had he done to deserve being made a target? A bullseye for pain, a vessel for suffering. Have you ever felt like life itself has aimed its arrows at you? Have you ever dared to ask if God himself had set you as a mark for sorrow? "If I have sinned," Job pleaded, "what have I done to you, you who see everything we do?" He spoke not from arrogance, but from bewildered humility. He saw no hidden rebellion, no secret corruption, and yet the blows kept falling. He cried out for forgiveness, not because he knew of any transgression, but because he longed for restoration, for the lifting of a burden that his heart could no longer bear. Before the silence returned, Job uttered one final aching hope. "Will you not pardon my offenses and forgive my sins? For I shall soon lie down in the dust. You will search for me, but I will be no more." It was not a cry of final despair. It was a soul laying itself bare, asking the only question that matters when the lights go out. Does God still see? Does he still care? And in the mystery of unanswered questions, Job's fragile faith still clung to the possibility of mercy. Even when he could not see it, he dared to cry out for it. Bildad's rebuke. God is just. You must be wrong. The Book of Job, chapter 8. When Eliphaz's words failed to break Job's resolve, another voice rose from the circle of ash and silence. Bildad the Shuhite. Unlike Eliphaz, whose speech began with a measure of politeness, Bildad struck hard and direct. "How long will you say such things?" he demanded. "Your words are a blustering wind." To Bildad, Job's cries were not the agonies of a wounded soul, but the reckless protests of a man unwilling to admit his guilt. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert what is right? For Bildad, the answer was obvious. God is just. Therefore, if Job was suffering, the fault must lie with Job. Have you ever faced someone so sure of their theology that there was no space left for your pain? Bildad's reasoning was simple and brutal. If your children died, it must be because they sinned against God. If you are now afflicted, it must be because you have turned away. Submit to God, he urged, and if you are pure and upright, even now he will rouse himself on your behalf and restore you to your prosperous state. A D. At first glance, the call to seek God sounded noble, but underneath it was a terrible assumption. Your suffering is your fault. Can you imagine hearing such words in your hour of greatest loss? Bildad pointed to the traditions of the fathers, to the wisdom of the ancients. He spoke of the fate of the godless, of withering reeds, of spider webs that collapse under weight, of plants that flourish briefly but are soon uprooted and forgotten. The message was clear. The wicked perish quickly. And if Job's life was crumbling, then he must be counted among them. But what Bildad failed to see was the deeper reality, that in a fallen world, the righteous often suffer precisely because they are righteous. That trials refine, and suffering can be the crucible of deeper faith, not the evidence of secret sin. Job's pain was not the result of rebellion. It was the battleground of unseen purposes. Bildad's theology, like Eliphaz's before him, was too small. It could not account for mystery. It could not make room for a righteous man to suffer unjustly while remaining beloved by God. And so, as Bildad finished speaking, the ashes around Job grew heavier, the distance between their hearts widened, and the true journey of faith pressed even deeper into the unknown. Job's anguish. How can mortal man be right before God? The Book of Job, chapter 9. After hearing Bildad's harsh words, Job did not respond with anger. He responded with sorrow, a sorrow so vast that it seemed to stretch beyond the edges of the earth itself. "Indeed, I know that this is true," he began, "but how can mere mortals prove their innocence before God?" Job did not deny the justice of God. He did not argue that the Almighty was wrong. Instead, he wrestled with a deeper, darker question. If God is perfectly holy and man is fragile and flawed, how could there ever be true reconciliation between them? If someone wished to dispute with him, they could not answer him once in 1,000 times. Job spoke of God's unstoppable power. He moves mountains without their knowing. He shakes the earth from its place. He commands the sun. He seals off the stars. Have you ever felt so small before the immensity of creation that you wondered if your voice could ever reach heaven? Job described a God who alone stretches out the heavens, who treads on the waves of the sea, who makes the Bear and Orion, the Pleiades and the constellations of the south. A God so immense that when he passes by, no one can perceive him. If he snatches away, Job said, who can stop him? Who can say to him, "What are you doing?" In the face of such majesty, Job saw himself not as a challenger but as dust, fragile, unseen, unheard. Even if he were innocent, he could not stand. Even if he washed himself with soap and cleansed his hands with lye, God could still plunge him into a pit, and his own clothes would abhor him. What chance does mortal man have to defend himself before the infinite? And then, amid his anguish, a cry rose from Job's heart, a prophetic longing that pointed beyond the ashes and the accusations. If only there was someone to mediate between us, someone to bring us together, someone to remove God's rod from me so that his terror would not frighten me anymore. A mediator, an advocate, a bridge between frail humanity and holy divinity. Have you ever longed for someone to stand between your brokenness and God's blazing holiness? Job's cry was more than personal desperation. It was a glimpse into the coming promise, a foreshadowing of the one who would one day stand in the gap, the one who would plead the cause of humanity with nail-scarred hands. Though Job could not yet see him, his soul reached out toward a salvation that had not yet been revealed, and heaven listened. In the silence between Job's anguish and God's answer, a seed of hope was planted, a hope that suffering is not the end of the story and that mercy can yet find a way. Job's plea, "Tell me why." The book of Job, chapter 10. With his soul bruised by loss and his mind battered by confusion, Job lifted his voice again, this time not merely in lament but in pleading. "I loathe my very life," he confessed. "Therefore I will give free rein to my complaint and speak out in the bitterness of my soul." Job turned directly to God, not to accuse him with rebellion, but to question him with raw, trembling honesty. "I say to God, do not declare me guilty, but tell me what charges you have against me. Have you ever pleaded with heaven not for escape, but simply for understanding?" Job's heart was not hardened, it was broken. He was not seeking revenge. He was seeking clarity, longing to know if his pain had purpose, or if it was merely the crushing weight of divine anger. "Does it please you to oppress me?" Job asked, "to spurn the work of your hands, while you smile on the plans of the wicked?" Job wrestled with the most haunting question of all. Had God created him only to destroy him? "You molded me like clay," he said. "Will you now turn me to dust again?" Job's words reveal an astonishing paradox. He saw himself as carefully, lovingly shaped by the Creator, and yet now treated as disposable, a vessel marred beyond recognition. Have you ever wondered if the dreams once planted in your heart were only meant to be crushed? "You clothed me with skin and flesh," Job remembered. "You knit me together with bones and sinews. You gave me life and showed me kindness, and in your providence watched over my spirit." Job could not deny the intimate care that had once marked his existence. He had known the touch of divine kindness. He had felt the nearness of a God who crafts each life with purpose. And that very knowledge made his present agony even more unbearable. If God had once loved him, why now this silence? Why this relentless sorrow? "Why then did you bring me out of the womb?" he cried. "I wish I had died before any eye saw me." Job's longing was not for vengeance. It was for peace, a desire to have never awakened to a life that now seemed cursed by heaven itself. "Are not my few days almost over?" he pleaded. "Turn away from me so I can have a moment's joy before I go to the land of gloom and utter darkness, to the land of deepest night, of utter darkness and disorder, where even the light is like darkness." In Job's vision, the grave was not a place of sweet rest, but of chaos and final silence. Yet even in his despair, even as he questioned everything, Job still spoke to God, still reached toward the one he could not fully understand. It is one thing to curse suffering. It is another to pour out every shattered hope at the feet of the Almighty and wait for an answer. Job was not abandoning faith. He was wrestling to keep it alive, and heaven was still listening. Zophar's harsh verdict, "You deserve worse." The book of Job, chapter 11. When Eliphaz's assumptions and Bildad's condemnations failed to silence Job's cries, Zophar the Naamathite stepped forward. And he carried no pretense of kindness. Zophar was not cautious. He was not careful. He came like a hammer striking already fractured stone. "Are all these words to go unanswered?" he asked. "Is this talker to be vindicated?" Zophar accused Job not only of wrongdoing, but of arrogance, of daring to claim purity before God. "Have you ever been wounded not just by the judgment of others, but by their complete lack of mercy?" "If only God would speak," Zophar declared. "If only he would tell you the secrets of wisdom. For true wisdom has two sides." He insisted that God's judgment was far greater than Job imagined, and that if God truly revealed the depth of Job's guilt, the punishment he had received would seem light in comparison. According to Zophar, Job did not deserve sympathy. He deserved worse. It is a heavy thing when the wounded are made to feel like criminals, when the broken are blamed for their own pain. "Can you fathom the mysteries of God?" Zophar asked. "Can you probe the limits of the Almighty?" The irony burned. Zophar spoke truths about God's greatness, truths that should have inspired humility and awe, but used them as weapons to crush a suffering man. Have you ever heard someone speak truth without love and felt how cold it can be? Zophar painted a picture of God whose justice was absolute and inescapable, but whose mercy seemed distant and rare. Yet even in his harshness, Zophar offered a path, not because he understood Job's heart, but because he clung to a simple formula: repent, and your life will be restored. "If you devote your heart to him," he urged, "if you stretch out your hands to him, you will lift up your face without shame." He promised security, brightness, and peace, but only if Job confessed sins he did not know he had committed. In Zophar's world, there was no room for mystery, no space for righteous suffering, no patience for unanswered questions. Pain had to mean guilt, loss had to mean punishment. But what Zophar could not see was that sometimes suffering is not a sign of God's rejection, but of his deeper work, refining faith, stripping away illusions, and preparing the soul for revelations it could never have reached in easier ways. Zophar's verdict was harsh, his vision narrow, his compassion absent. And Job, still seated in the ashes, still wrestling with God in the silence, found himself more alone than ever. Job's irony: "You are no better than I." The Book of Job, chapter 12. Job, surrounded by men who claimed to understand the ways of God, answered not with quiet submission, but with cutting irony. "Doubtless you are the only people who matter," he said, "and wisdom will die with you." His words carried the sharp edge of a man who had been judged without mercy, a man whose soul had been weighed not by God, but by human opinions too small to grasp his pain. Have you ever been crushed under the judgment of those who think they have all the answers? Job acknowledged what his friends refused to see. "I have become a laughingstock to my friends, though I called on God and he answered, a mere laughingstock, though righteous and blameless." He pointed to a grim reality. Those who are secure often despise those whose lives have been shattered. Misfortune, they believe, must mean fault. But Job knew differently. He looked beyond human systems of reward and punishment and pointed to the wider world, to nature itself, as evidence that suffering is not always tied to personal sin. "Ask the animals," he said, "and they will teach you, or the birds in the sky, and they will tell you. The beasts of the field, the fish of the sea, all testified to the sovereignty of God over life and death, over prosperity and ruin. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every creature and the breath of all mankind." Have you ever felt that even creation understands truths that human pride refuses to see? Job did not deny the greatness of God. In fact, he exalted it. He described the Lord as the one who tears down and cannot be rebuilt, who imprisons and none can release, who holds wisdom and strength, counsel and understanding. To Job, God was not small enough to fit into human equations. He was not a divine accountant, dispensing blessings and curses based on simple formulas. He is the Lord of mysteries, the one who holds both the powerful and the weak in his hand, the one who overturns human pride and humbles kings and priests alike. Job's irony was not mere bitterness. It was a desperate defense of a deeper truth, that God's ways are higher than human understanding, and that suffering does not always mean condemnation. In the ashes of his broken life, Job still lifted his voice to declare a God bigger than formulas, more sovereign than human wisdom, and more mysterious than easy answers could ever capture. Job's bold plea, "Let me speak to God directly." The Book of Job, chapter 13. Job, wearied by the hollow counsel of his friends, turned his heart to a bolder cry. He would no longer defend himself before men. He longed to stand before God himself. "My eyes have seen all this, my ears have heard and understood it. What you know I also know, I am not inferior to you." Job refused to accept their assumptions. He saw through their pretensions of wisdom and recognized that their arguments were built on foundations too weak to bear the weight of real suffering. "But I desire to speak to the Almighty," he declared, "and to argue my case with God." Have you ever wished you could bypass the confusion of human voices and lay your questions bare before the one who sees all? Job accused his friends of being worthless physicians, offering diagnoses that only deepened the wound. Their speeches were like smokescreens, trying to defend God with half-truths and false accusations. "If only you would be altogether silent," Job said. "For you, that would be wisdom." Sometimes silence speaks more truth than the loudest arguments. Sometimes compassion says more than explanations ever could. Job was not seeking to escape judgment. On the contrary, he was willing to face it, so long as it came from the hand of God himself and not from the mouths of men who misunderstood him. "Though he slay me," Job cried, "yet I will hope in him. I will surely defend my ways to his face." This was not defiance rooted in pride. It was a fierce, trembling hope rooted in relationship. Job knew that true justice, true understanding, could only come from the one who had knit him together in his mother's womb. He asked for two things: that God would withdraw his hand from him, and that he would not terrify him with dread. Then Job pleaded for a hearing, an honest face-to-face encounter with his Creator. How many times have you longed for clarity, not from the world, but from the one whose word alone can heal the soul? Job begged to understand his charges. He wanted to know why he had become a target. Was it for sins committed in secret? Was it because God had counted him as an enemy? He poured out his confusion, his despair, and his desperate longing. He did not want to die in ignorance. He did not want to fade away under accusations that were not true. More than vindication, Job longed for connection, to know that God still saw him, that God still cared, that God would not let him vanish like a discarded breath in the wind. In the ashes, among broken dreams and unanswered prayers, Job clung to the only hope he had left, that even if man misunderstood him, even if the earth forgot him, God would not. The frailty of man and the hope beyond death. The Book of Job, chapter 14. Job's voice softened, not with resignation, but with the aching weight of reality. "Mortals," he said, "born of woman, are of few days, and full of trouble." Life, in Job's view, was a passing shadow, a flower that blooms briefly and withers, a fleeting breath that cannot be held. He spoke not only of his own sorrow, but of the universal frailty that defines every human life. Have you ever felt the brevity of your days pressing on your soul, reminding you how fragile every heartbeat truly is? Job pleaded with God, "Look away from them and let them alone, till they have put in their time like hired laborers." In other words, let man live his short, struggling days without unnecessary suffering, for the toil is hard enough. Yet even as he mourned the frailty of life, a seed of hope stirred within him. He observed that when a tree is cut down, there is still hope. It can sprout again at the scent of water. But when a human being dies, he asked, "Where is the hope?" He spoke of men who lie down and do not rise, of heavens that remain silent over the grave. Yet hidden within his lament, a deeper longing broke through, a daring hope that defied the silence of death. "If someone dies, will they live again?" he asked. "All the days of my hard service, I will wait for my renewal to come." And here in the ashes of despair, Job glimpsed something that shone beyond the grave, a resurrection hope, a restoration not limited to this life, but reaching into eternity. Have you ever dared to believe in life beyond the grave when everything around you speaks of endings? Job longed for a time when God would call and he would answer, when the sorrow of earth would be swallowed up by the joy of reunion. You will long for the creature your hands have made, he said, speaking of a divine yearning for redemption, for restoration. Even as he wrestled with doubt, even as he mourned the harshness of life, Job's heart reached forward into a future he could not fully see, but one he dared to believe was real. It was not a certainty born of sight. It was a hope forged in the fire of affliction. And in that hope, Job kept breathing, kept waiting, kept trusting that the hand that had once formed him from dust would one day call him back to life again. Eliphaz's second attack. Only the wicked suffer this way. The Book of Job, chapter 15. The silence after Job's daring hope did not last long. Eliphaz the Temanite took up his voice again, but this time his words carried a sharper, colder edge. Would a wise person answer with empty notions, he asked, or fill their belly with the hot east wind? Gone was the initial caution, the gentle facade of sympathy. Now Eliphaz spoke plainly. Job's words were foolish, dangerous, and evidence of hidden rebellion. Your sin prompts your mouth, he accused. You adopt the tongue of the crafty. Have you ever poured out your soul in pain, only to have someone accuse you of pride for daring to speak? Eliphaz claimed that Job's very protests against injustice proved his guilt. In his view, innocence suffered in silence. Only the wicked raised their voices in complaint. His theology was rigid, unforgiving, a structure with no room for mystery, no patience for those who bled aloud. If you sin, Eliphaz reasoned, should God not punish you? He painted a grim picture, a vision where wicked men suffer swift, inescapable judgment. The homes of the godless consumed, their children crushed, their possessions stripped away by strangers. Eliphaz insisted that Job's suffering fit this pattern perfectly, that if Job was enduring such misery, it could only mean he was among the wicked, even if his sins were hidden from human eyes. Have you ever been misunderstood so deeply that even your honesty was twisted against you? The dangerous thing about Eliphaz's words was that they were stitched with half-truths. Yes, God judges wickedness. Yes, rebellion reaps sorrow, but not every wound is a punishment. Not every suffering is a sign of guilt. Sometimes the righteous bleed, sometimes the faithful weep, and sometimes the greatest evidence of loyalty is not blessing, but endurance through the wilderness of silence. Eliphaz could not imagine a world where God's beloved suffer not because of wrath, but because of deeper purposes unseen. And so he misjudged his friend, added weight to an already broken soul, and missed the greater story unfolding beyond human wisdom. Job listened, but he did not yield, for in the ashes, Job still clung to a God bigger than Eliphaz's explanations, a God whose justice might be slower, but whose mercy ran deeper than human minds could grasp. Job's lament, God has torn me apart, the Book of Job, chapter 16. Job lifted his voice again, but this time not to argue theology, not to protest accusations, but to pour out the raw agony of a soul that felt abandoned by heaven itself. I have heard many things like these, he said to his friends. Miserable comforters are you all. Their words, meant to instruct, had only deepened his wound. Will your long-winded speeches never end? He cried. What ails you that you keep on arguing? Have you ever longed not for explanations, but simply for someone to sit with you in silence and weep? Job imagined himself in their place. If you were in my place, he said, I could also speak like you. I could make fine speeches against you. But he would have chosen differently. He would have comforted, strengthened, lifted the fainting heart. Instead, his so-called friends only magnified his suffering. Job turned his focus upward, and his lament grew darker still. Surely God has worn me out. He has devastated my entire household. He has shriveled me up. and it has become a witness against me." Job saw himself not only afflicted by circumstances, but wounded by the very hand of God. Like a warrior besieged by an unstoppable enemy, he felt hunted, torn apart, his dignity dragged through the dust. "God assails me," he cried, with wave upon wave. Job was not questioning God's existence. He was grappling with his purposes, struggling to understand how the God who had once blessed him now seemed to treat him as an adversary. In his sorrow, a breathtaking cry rose from the depths of his soul, a cry that pointed beyond the ashes, beyond the silence, into the very heart of redemptive history. "Even now," Job declared, "my witness is in heaven, my advocate is on high." Have you ever dared to believe, even in your darkest night, that someone in heaven sees your pain and pleads your cause? Job longed for an intercessor, someone who would stand between him and the incomprehensible greatness of God, someone who would bridge the gap between dust and divinity. His words form one of the clearest prophetic glimpses of the coming Messiah, the mediator who would plead the case of broken humanity before the throne of absolute holiness. "My intercessor is my friend," Job said, "as my eyes pour out tears to God. On behalf of a man, he pleads with God as one pleads for a friend." Even as he sat among the ashes, even as he felt abandoned, a whisper of hope stirred in Job's heart, that heaven was not deaf, that mercy was not absent, that somewhere beyond the storm, an advocate was already speaking his name. The agony was real, the accusations were cruel, but Job's faith, battered and bleeding, still clung to a future redemption, a redemption he could not yet see, but one he dared to believe was coming. The cry of a man with no hope left. The Book of Job, chapter 17. Job's voice grew fainter, as if each word were wrested from the ruins of his soul. "My spirit is broken," he said. "My days are cut short. The grave awaits me." Hope, once the quiet strength beneath his prayers, now seemed like a distant memory, a dream erased by relentless pain. Job saw the faces of his friends twisted with mockery, offering counsel that stung instead of healed. He felt abandoned by the world, and at times even by heaven. "Surely mockers surround me," he cried, "and my eyes must dwell on their hostility." Have you ever reached a place so barren, so desolate, that even your dreams seem like a cruelty? Job pleaded for relief, for someone to stand as his pledge, someone to guarantee his innocence before God. He knew that no man would stand for him. The very people who should have upheld him now cast him down with their shallow accusations. Yet even in this valley of despair, Job clung to a sliver of faith, a fragile thread refusing to snap under the weight of sorrow. "You have closed their minds to understanding," he said of his accusers. "Therefore, you will not let them triumph." Job's cry revealed an astonishing truth. Even when hope felt dead, even when life itself seemed a mockery, he still believed that justice, true justice, was anchored not in men's opinions, but in the heart of God. His vision of the future, however, grew darker. He spoke of the grave as his house, of making his bed in darkness, of calling the pit his father and the worms his mother and sisters. It was a grim portrait of mortality, a world where the only certainty was the descent into the tomb. "Where then is my hope?" he asked. "Who can see any hope for me?" Have you ever found yourself asking whether light would ever break through again? Job's body was wasting. His reputation was shattered. His dreams were buried under grief. Yet somewhere, hidden even from his own sight, the embers of hope still flickered. Job dared to speak of hope, not because he felt it in his flesh, but because he remembered its root in God's character. A hope that outlasts understanding. A hope that is not snuffed out by death itself. Though everything around him shouted defeat, Job's spirit, broken but not destroyed, held on to the possibility that beyond the grave, beyond the silence, a voice still called him beloved. And heaven, though silent for a moment longer, was listening. Bildad's cold logic, the fate of the wicked, the Book of Job, chapter 18. The words of Job, heavy with grief and fragments of hope, were met not with compassion, but with cold, calculated judgment. Bildad, the Shuhite, spoke again, this time not with the fumbling concern of a friend, but with the biting certainty of a prosecutor. "When will you end these speeches?" he demanded. "Be sensible, and then we can talk." Ginda. Bildad was not interested in understanding, he was interested in condemning. He framed Job's suffering in brutal terms, painting a vivid, merciless portrait of what happens to the wicked. Have you ever been wounded by someone who used truth as a weapon instead of a balm? Bildad described the fate of the evildoer, their lamps snuffed out, their steps weakened, their plans thwarted, their own schemes bringing about their downfall. "The light in his tent becomes dark," he said. "The lamp beside him goes out." It was an image of utter desolation, a life once bright, now swallowed by darkness and defeat. Bildad spoke of nets that ensnare, traps that spring without warning, terrors that pursue relentlessly, disease that eats away unseen. He depicted a man torn from the security of his home, marched before the king of terrors, a picture not just of earthly ruin, but of divine judgment executed without mercy. And all the while, though he never named Job directly, the implication was unmistakable. This ruin, this darkness, this horror was where Job now stood. Have you ever felt the coldness of being judged not for what you did, but for the pain you could not explain? Bildad made no room for mystery, no space for innocence in suffering. To him, righteousness always prospered, and wickedness always ended in destruction. His world was simple, his theology brutal. Job's collapse could only mean guilt, but what Bildad could not grasp was that sometimes the lamp flickers not because God has forsaken it, but because it is being tested in a furnace unseen by mortal eyes. Job was not the embodiment of wickedness. He was the battlefield where unseen truths were being forged, where faith was being refined in ways Bildad's rigid logic could never comprehend. And so, even as Bildad's words fell like stones, the true story, the deeper story, continued unfolding in silence before the throne of heaven. Job's cry of faith, "I know that my Redeemer lives." The book of Job, chapter 19. After wave upon wave of accusation, after the bitterness of betrayal and the ache of abandonment, Job spoke again. But this time, his words did not arise from despair alone. They carried the burning light of unshakable hope. "How long will you torment me," he cried, "and crush me with words?" His friends had failed him. Their judgment had deepened his suffering, adding insult to injury. "Though I cry violence, I get no response," Job lamented. "Though I call for help, there is no justice." He described how even his family, his servants, even the children in the streets had turned against him. He was a man stripped of everything, his wealth, his health, his reputation, his dignity. Have you ever stood so alone that even the memories of former kindnesses seemed to mock you? Job begged for pity, not judgment. "Have pity on me, my friends," he pleaded, "for the hand of God has struck me." But it was at this lowest point, this place of utter desolation, that one of the greatest declarations of faith in all Scripture rose from Job's lips. "I know that my Redeemer lives," he proclaimed, "and that in the end he will stand on the earth. Even as his flesh wasted away, even as death cast its long shadow, Job clung to the certainty that justice and restoration were not dead. He did not base this hope on circumstances. He did not find it in the fairness of life. He anchored it in the living reality of a Redeemer, someone who would defend him, someone who would rescue his name and his soul. Have you ever dared to hope against everything your eyes could see? Job's faith stretched beyond the grave. "After my skin has been destroyed," he said, "yet in my flesh I will see God." It was not mere survival he longed for. It was resurrection. It was the restoration of relationship with the one who had fashioned him. "I myself will see him," Job declared, "with my own eyes, I, and not another." This was not wishful thinking. It was a prophetic certainty, a revelation shining through the smoke and ashes of human suffering. Though he could not yet explain his pain, Though heaven seemed silent and the earth seemed cruel, Job anchored his hope in a God who would not leave him in the grave, a God who would one day make all things right. And in that moment, Job stood taller than his accusers, taller than his sorrow, taller than death itself. His body was broken, but his faith blazed with life, and heaven, though still silent, was preparing its answer. Zophar's last assault. The triumph of the wicked is brief. The book of Job, chapter 20. Zophar, the Naamathite, could not remain silent after Job's astounding declaration of faith, but his words did not reflect wonder or reflection, only hardened fury. "My troubled thoughts prompt me to answer," he said, "because I am greatly disturbed." Zophar's anger burned not because of Job's suffering, but because Job dared to maintain his innocence, dared to hope for redemption. And so Zophar launched into a speech filled with harshness and certainty, painting a vivid, relentless portrait of the downfall of the wicked. "Surely you know how it has been from of old," he declared, "ever since mankind was placed on the earth, that the mirth of the wicked is brief, the joy of the godless lasts but a moment." In Zophar's world, evil men may rise quickly, may taste fleeting triumph, but soon, inevitably, they are cast down into ruin. Have you ever felt the sharpness of words used not to heal, but to drive the blade of condemnation deeper? Zophar described the wicked as men whose pride reaches the heavens, but who perish like their own dung, vanishing so completely that no one even remembers them. Their children must beg from the poor, their bones full of youthful vigor will lie in the dust. The taste of evil, once sweet in their mouths, becomes the poison of vipers within them. Zophar's description was brutal, absolute, and unmistakably aimed at Job. Without naming him directly, Zophar implied that Job's former prosperity, his former reputation, had only masked a deeper corruption, and that now at last, justice was exposing what lay beneath. The wicked, he said, would vomit up the wealth they had consumed, would feel the venom of their own sins destroying them from within. Their stolen gains would return to dust. Their secret pleasures would rot away. Their hidden pride would drag them down to an ignoble grave. Zophar's doctrine was a hammer, swift, merciless, without nuance. There was no space in his vision for the righteous who suffer, no patience for the mysteries of divine purpose. For Zophar, there was only cause and effect. Wickedness brings ruin, and if you suffer, you must be wicked. How often are simple truths twisted into cruel weapons, ignoring the unseen wars waged within broken hearts. But Job's story was not a story of secret sin exposed. It was a story of unseen faith tested beyond human understanding. A story of loyalty forged not in blessing, but in the fires of loss. Zophar's last assault thundered across the ash heap where Job sat, but the deeper reality, the one that heaven alone could see, remained untouched. Because sometimes triumph is not measured by prosperity, but by a faith that refuses to die even when the whole world condemns it. The prosperity of the wicked, Job's bold protest. The book of Job, chapter 21. Job, battered by accusation after accusation, lifted his voice again, this time with a clarity that cut through the easy answers of his friends. "Listen carefully to my words," he pleaded. "Let this be the consolation you give me." Job was not asking for agreement. He was asking for attention, for his friends to hear not only his pain, but his challenge to their entire system of thought. "Why do the wicked live on?" he asked, "growing old and increasing in power?" Job pointed to a reality that his friends refused to see. The wicked often prosper. They build houses that stand secure. They see their children established around them. Their homes are safe from fear. Their livestock thrives. Their days are filled with music and joy. Have you ever struggled with the injustice of watching evil flourish while the righteous suffer in silence? They spend their years in prosperity, Job said, and go down to the grave in peace. This picture shattered the neat formulas of Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. It challenged the simplistic idea that suffering is always the punishment of sin, and prosperity always the reward of righteousness. Job acknowledged a terrible mystery. God does not always settle accounts on human timetables. The wicked may defy God openly, saying, "Leave us alone. We have no desire to know your ways." Yet their lamp is not always immediately snuffed out. Their power is not always quickly broken. Have you ever wondered why heaven seems silent while injustice roars unchecked? Job dared to ask aloud what many fear to even whisper: is God's justice truly visible in the short span of human life? He mocked the idea that punishment always falls swiftly. "Who can teach knowledge to God?" he said, "since he judges even the highest. Some die in full vigor, their bodies healthy and nourished. Others die in bitterness of soul, never having enjoyed anything good. And both lie side by side in the dust, worms covering them alike. The great leveling of death, the silence that mocks human pride, the mystery that humbles even the boldest assumptions." Job accused his friends of offering comfort that was false, of clinging to ideas that could not hold under the weight of real suffering. Their answers might have soothed their own fears, but they did not match the brutal complexity of life under the sun. And Job, though still surrounded by ashes, though still aching with unanswered questions, refused to surrender to lies wrapped in pious words. In the deep shadows of his pain, he clung not to the certainty of easy answers, but to the hope that justice would one day be revealed, not on the fragile stage of this world, but before the throne where no hidden thing remains unseen. Eliphaz's final accusation: "You have hidden sin." The Book of Job, chapter 22. The patience of Job's friends had worn thin, and with it, the thin veil of politeness. Eliphaz, who once spoke carefully, now abandoned caution altogether. He accused Job directly, no longer implying but declaring guilt. "Is it for your piety that he rebukes you and brings charges against you?" he demanded. Eliphaz charged Job with crimes he had never witnessed, with exploiting the poor, with withholding food and water, with sending away widows empty-handed, with crushing the fatherless. None of these accusations were true. But to Eliphaz, Job's suffering demanded an explanation, and if it could not be found in the open, it must lie hidden in secret sins. Have you ever been falsely accused by those who preferred assumptions over truth? Eliphaz painted a picture of divine judgment falling like a flood, sweeping away the wicked who thought themselves secure. He warned Job that darkness awaited the defiant, that ruin would consume those who hid from God's light. Yet even amid his harsh accusations, Eliphaz offered a path to restoration, a path tied not to compassion, but to the demand for confession. "Submit to God and be at peace with him," he urged. "In this way prosperity will come to you." He spoke of gold returning to Job's tent, of the Almighty becoming his treasure once more. But the offer was poisoned. It was based on the premise that Job's suffering must be the result of hidden evil, and that restoration depended on Job acknowledging sins he had not committed. Have you ever felt the burden of expectations that do not match the truth of your own soul? Eliphaz's theology remained transactional to the end: repent and be rewarded, refuse and be destroyed. But Job's story was far deeper than transactions. It was not a story of bargains with heaven. It was the refining of faith through a fire few would dare to endure. While Eliphaz spoke with certainty, he missed the heart of what was unfolding, that sometimes the righteous suffer, not because they are far from God, but because they walk closer to mysteries too great for easy answers. And heaven, though still silent, was preparing a revelation that would shatter all the false charges. The hidden God, Job's cry for encounter. The Book of Job, chapter 23. After the storm of false accusations, after the endless voices seeking to explain his suffering, Job turned again, not toward men, but toward heaven. Even amid silence, he dared to lift his cry to the God he could no longer find. "Even today," Job said, "my complaint is bitter, his hand is heavy in spite of my groaning." He longed for one thing above all else, not relief, not explanations, but an encounter. "If only I knew where to find him," Job pleaded. "If only I could go to his dwelling." Have you ever felt that ache in your spirit, not just to be heard by God, but to see Him, to stand before Him face to face? Job imagined himself pleading his case directly before the Almighty, laying out his arguments not in arrogance, but in desperate honesty. "I would state my case before Him," he said, "and fill my mouth with arguments. I would find out what He would answer me and consider what He would say to me." In his heart, Job trusted that God would not crush him, that the judge of all the earth would treat him with understanding, not contempt. Yet even as he confessed his longing, Job admitted the pain of God's apparent absence. "But if I go to the east, He is not there. If I go to the west, I do not find Him." He searched to the north and south, but the Almighty remained hidden from his view. There is a sorrow deeper than suffering, the sorrow of feeling abandoned by the very one who holds your soul. Have you ever searched for God in the midst of silence, when every prayer seems to vanish into the void? Yet even here, even now, Job's faith did not fully collapse. "But He knows the way that I take," Job declared, "and when He has tested me, I will come forth as gold." It was a faith refined by fire, a trust that even when God seemed invisible, His purposes were still at work. Job committed himself to the path of obedience, even when understanding was denied him. "My feet have closely followed His steps," he said. "I have kept to His way without turning aside." In the mystery of divine hiddenness, Job held to a fierce, trembling hope that the silence was not abandonment but a refining, a journey through darkness toward a glory not yet revealed. God was hidden, but not absent, silent, but not indifferent. And Job's cry for encounter, for vindication, for the restoration of relationship echoed through the heavens. The story was not finished, and the God who seemed hidden was already nearer than Job dared imagine. Injustice unpunished. Job's deepest complaint. The book of Job, chapter 24. Job's cry deepened. Not only was he wrestling with personal pain, but now his eyes opened to a darker sorrow, the brokenness of the world itself. "Why does the Almighty not set times for judgment?" he asked. "Why must those who know Him look in vain for such days?" Job surveyed the world around him and saw oppression reigning where justice should have ruled. He spoke of those who move boundary stones, stealing land that was not theirs, of those who drive away the flocks of the fatherless, crushing the already broken. The vulnerable, the orphan, the widow, the poor were trampled underfoot, while the wicked flourished in arrogance. Have you ever looked at the world and wondered how long injustice will be allowed to stand? Job described the homeless shivering in the cold, the hungry scavenging for scraps, the children abandoned without help. He saw laborers harvesting fields they did not own, pressed into endless toil with no reward. He spoke of those who preyed on the weak, the murderer rising with the light to kill the poor and needy, the thief lurking at night, the adulterer waiting for the shadows to hide his shame. And through it all, he asked the question that haunts every generation: where is the justice of God? Why do the wicked go on living, growing old and gaining power? Job did not deny that judgment would eventually come. He acknowledged that evil is fleeting, that it will, in time, be swept away like foam on the surface of water. But he lamented the delay, the unbearable silence that allowed evil to flourish unchecked for now. Have you ever wrestled with the seeming slowness of divine justice, when the cries of the oppressed seem to rise unanswered into the sky? Job's complaint was not rebellion. It was the groaning of a heart still tethered to the hope that righteousness matters, that the cries of the broken are heard even when heaven seems hidden. He knew that darkness would not reign forever, but the waiting, the aching silence of waiting, was almost more than his soul could bear. And yet, Job chose to lift that unbearable weight before God, trusting that somehow, beyond the shadows, the judge of all the earth would indeed do right. Bildad's shallow theology. How can man be pure? The book of Job, chapter 25. After Job's deep and painful cry for justice, Bildad the Shuhite spoke again, but his words were brief, almost hollow. Dominion and awe belong to God, he said, yet he establishes order in the heights of heaven. Bildad did not deny the greatness of God. He exalted his authority, his purity, his sovereignty over all creation. But his words, though true in part, offered no healing, no hope, only the cold reminder of human smallness. How then can a mortal be righteous before God? He asked. How can one born of woman be pure? Have you ever sought comfort in your pain and received only lectures about your unworthiness? Bildad painted a cosmic scale so vast that humanity appeared insignificant, like maggots crawling upon the earth, like worms beneath the gaze of holy stars. Even the moon, he said, is not bright before God, and the stars are not pure in his sight. If even the heavens fall short of his glory, how much more the frail children of dust? There was a truth hidden in Bildad's words, a truth about the overwhelming holiness of God and the deep chasm between creator and creature. But truth, spoken without love, becomes a weapon rather than a healing balm. Have you ever felt that someone told you theological facts, yet missed the heart that was breaking beneath those facts? Bildad's theology was shallow, not because he misunderstood God's greatness, but because he failed to grasp God's mercy. He saw the distance, but not the bridge. He saw the impurity of man, but not the coming Redeemer who would span the impossible gap. In the ashes, Job did not need reminders of his frailty. He already knew the weight of human limitation. What he longed for was the assurance that the God who is holy is also near to the brokenhearted. But from Bildad, there would be no comfort, only the cold echo of distance. And yet, beyond the shallow speeches, beyond the misunderstanding of friends, Job's soul still reached for something deeper, for a justice, a mercy, a restoration that the hollow words of men could never provide. The majesty of God and the mystery of his ways. The Book of Job, chapter 26. After enduring shallow arguments and false accusations, Job lifted his voice once more, but now not in defense of himself, nor in protest against injustice, but in awe before the majesty of God. He began with a cutting irony. How you have helped the powerless, how you have saved the arm that is feeble, mocking the empty wisdom of his friends. Then his tone shifted. Job turned from human folly to divine grandeur. He spoke of the unseen realms, of the dead trembling beneath the waters, of the realm of destruction lying naked before God. He described the greatness of the Almighty, whose power stretches the heavens over the void, who suspends the earth over nothing. Have you ever gazed into the vastness of creation and felt your soul fall silent in wonder? Job spoke of God binding up the waters in thick clouds, yet the clouds do not burst under their weight. He marked out the horizon on the face of the waters, set boundaries between light and darkness. He described the trembling of the pillars of heaven, astonished at his rebuke. The seas churned at his command. The heavens themselves were pierced by his spirit. By his wisdom, he shattered the proud serpent, a picture of God's triumph over forces of chaos and rebellion. And then, after painting the breathtaking panorama of creation, Job paused. These are but the outer fringe of his works, he said. How faint the whisper we hear of him. Who then can understand the thunder of his power? All that he had described, the architecture of the universe, the taming of chaos, the orchestration of life itself, was only the faintest whisper of the true fullness of God's power and majesty. Have you ever realized that what we know of God, even at our most enlightened moments, is only the barest beginning of who he truly is? Job's words remind us that reverence must rise higher than explanations, that awe must carry us farther than answers. Though he struggled to understand his own suffering, Job recognized that the greatness of God could not be contained by human logic or measured by mortal expectations. And so, standing among ashes, with his questions still burning unanswered, Job worshipped, not with certainty, but with wonder. The God who seemed distant was still majestic. The silence of heaven was not emptiness, but mystery deeper than words. And somewhere beyond the whisper, beyond the outer fringes, thunder was preparing to speak. Job's oath of integrity, the book of Job, chapter 27. In the silence that followed, the futile accusations of his friends, Job rose with a solemn declaration, not a protest of pride, but a sacred oath of truth. "As surely as God lives, who has denied me justice," he said, "and the Almighty, who has made my life bitter, as long as I have life within me, my lips will not say anything wicked, and my tongue will not utter lies." Job refused to defend himself by bending the truth. He would not save his reputation through deceit, nor comfort himself with falsehoods. Have you ever faced a moment where holding to truth cost you more than compromise ever would? Though wounded, though bewildered, Job clung fiercely to the one thing that no accusation could strip away, his integrity. "I will maintain my innocence and never let go of it," he declared. "My conscience will not reproach me as long as I live." Job's stand was not against God. It was against the false narratives that sought to force him into a mold of guilt he did not bear. He did not claim perfection. He claimed honesty, an honest walk before the Almighty, even when heaven seemed silent. Job then turned his attention to the fate of the truly wicked. What hope of the godless when they are cut off, when God takes away their life? He asked. He described a chilling reality, that the wicked may prosper for a time, but in the end, their cries for help would be met with silence. Their accumulated wealth would vanish. Their houses would crumble like moth-eaten garments. Have you ever been tempted to envy the prosperity of those who build on injustice, only to remember that their foundation cannot stand forever? Job saw beyond the immediate. He recognized that appearances deceive, that true security is not found in wealth or reputation, but in the unseen favor of God. The wicked might pile up silver like dust, might build grand houses, but ultimately they would lie down in the dust, and others would divide their possessions. Even as he suffered unjustly, Job refused to equate temporary suffering with ultimate defeat. He knew that vindication does not always come in the timelines of men, but it comes. And though his friends misjudged him, and though his body bore the marks of sorrow, Job's soul clung to a deeper certainty. That integrity, tested by fire, outlasts every storm, and the eyes of heaven, though hidden for a moment, saw it all. The hidden wisdom of God. The book of Job, chapter 28. Amid the wreckage of accusations and unanswered prayers, Job paused, and from the ashes rose a meditation unlike any before. He turned his gaze from suffering to something deeper, the mystery of wisdom. "There is a mine for silver," Job said, "a place where gold is refined. Iron is taken from the earth, and copper is smelted from ore." Human ingenuity, he reflected, can reach into the darkest veins of the earth, digging, carving, extracting treasures hidden far beneath the surface. The miner's lamp pierces the gloom, and mankind overturns mountains in pursuit of precious metals. Have you ever marveled at how relentless humanity can be in seeking what it deems valuable? Job marveled at this, and then asked the question that silences even the most ambitious soul. But where can wisdom be found? Where does understanding dwell? Gold cannot buy it. Silver cannot weigh it. It is not found in the land of the living. The deep says, "It is not in me." The sea says, "It is not with me." No amount of wealth, no effort of human hands can uncover the wisdom that governs life and death, justice and mercy, joy and sorrow. Job listed all the riches of the earth, onyx and sapphire, coral and jasper, and declared that none could match the worth of wisdom. Have you ever searched for answers in the wrong places, only to find that the greatest truths cannot be seized by force? Wisdom, Job said, is hidden from the eyes of every living thing, concealed even from the birds of the sky. Destruction and death whisper of it, saying, "Only a rumor of it has reached our ears." Where, then, is true wisdom found? Job's voice grew quiet, reverent, as he delivered the answer that had burned through centuries. God understands the way to it, and he alone knows where it dwells. for he views the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. When he established the force of the wind, and measured out the waters, when he made a decree for the rain, and a path for the thunderstorm, then he looked at wisdom and appraised it. He confirmed it and tested it, and he said to the human race, "The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding." True wisdom does not come from mines or markets. It does not arise from cleverness or ambition. It is born in reverence, in standing humbly before the one whose ways are higher than ours, whose purposes weave through time unseen. Job, though still clothed in sorrow, had grasped a truth larger than his pain, that wisdom is not something we conquer. It is something we receive, on our knees, in awe, before the living God. The memory of lost glory. The book of Job, chapter 29. From the ashes of his suffering, Job allowed his mind to wander back to a time before the darkness fell. "Oh, that I were as in months gone by," he sighed, "when God watched over me." He remembered the days when his life overflowed with light, when divine favor seemed to rest tangibly upon him. "When his lamp shone over my head," Job recalled, "and by his light I walked through darkness." There was a time when God's nearness had not been a question, but a certainty, when each step seemed blessed, each decision guided. Have you ever looked back on seasons of joy and wondered how they slipped away so quickly? Job described his former days in vivid strokes. His children surrounded him like a living crown. His path was washed with cream. The rocks poured out streams of oil. He was not only prosperous, he was revered. When Job walked through the city gates, young men withdrew in respect, and the old rose to their feet. Princes stopped speaking, nobles held their tongues. He had been a voice for the voiceless, a defender of the poor, a father to the needy, an advocate for the stranger. "I rescued the poor who cried for help," he said, "and the fatherless who had none to assist them." The blessings of those ready to perish rested upon him. He made the widow's heart sing for joy. Have you ever tasted the satisfaction of living a life that mattered, of knowing that your days left the world brighter than you found it? Job wore righteousness as his clothing, justice as his robe and turban. He was eyes to the blind, feet to the lame, a father to the needy. He broke the fangs of the wicked and snatched victims from their teeth. His influence had been undeniable, his place in the world secure. He had expected to die in peace, to live out his days in dignity, to see his roots deep and his branches strong. But now, that life seemed like a dream slipping through trembling hands. What once was certain now felt like a phantom, a memory more painful than comforting. Yet in remembering, Job was not simply longing for lost status. He was crying out for the God who had once walked so closely beside him. And though he could not yet see the full arc of his journey, his heart, even in longing, still reached toward the faithfulness he once knew. The memory of lost glory was not the end of Job's story. It was the ache that pointed beyond, toward a restoration far greater than he could yet imagine. The depth of present humiliation. The book of Job, chapter 30. As the memories of former glory faded, Job's voice broke under the weight of his present reality. "But now," he said, and the words fell heavy as stones, "but now they mock me, men younger than I, whose fathers I would have disdained to put with my sheepdogs." Once honored among the elders, Job now found himself the object of scorn, not from the mighty, but from the lowliest outcasts. Men who had been outlaws, driven from society, spat at him with disdain. They circled him like wild dogs, rejoicing at his downfall. Have you ever tasted the bitterness of seeing honor turned into mockery, kindness repaid with cruelty? Job's body, once vigorous and strong, was now racked with relentless pain. Terrors overwhelmed him, his skin blackened and peeled. His frame clung to his bones. He cried out, "And now my life ebbs away. Days of suffering grip me." He described himself as someone abandoned, tossed aside by both man and, it seemed, by heaven itself. God, who once had sheltered him, now felt like an archer aiming poisoned arrows at his soul. The same hands that once felt wrapped in divine favor now felt pierced by divine silence. "My lyre is tuned to mourning," he said, "and my pipe to the sound of wailing." Once the music of his life had been songs of joy. Now every note was grief. Have you ever lived a season so heavy that even your laughter sounded like sorrow? Job's humiliation was total: social, physical, emotional, and spiritual. He was no longer the man who sat at the gates dispensing wisdom. He was the outcast that others avoided, the wounded man whom children mocked in the streets. Yet even in this brutal honesty, Job did not curse God. He did not deny his existence. He simply poured out his brokenness at the feet of the one whose purposes he could no longer see. The depth of present humiliation stood in stark contrast to the memory of lost glory. And yet, beneath both, something deeper was being carved into Job's soul, a trust that would outlast both exaltation and disgrace. The ashes still clung to his skin, the sores still burned across his flesh, but Job's voice, though cracked and trembling, continued to rise. Because even when the world forgets, even when strength fades, the cry of a faithful heart still reaches the throne of heaven. The final oath, Job's integrity before God. The book of Job, chapter 31. At the end of all arguments, at the close of all accusations, Job stood alone, not in defiance but in truth. He lifted a final solemn oath before heaven, laying bare every part of his life under the watchful eye of the Almighty. "I made a covenant with my eyes," he declared, "not to look lustfully at a young woman." His integrity was not shallow, not maintained only before others, but rooted in the hidden places of the heart. Job went deeper. He examined his actions toward his servants, his treatment of the poor, his dealings in business, his attitude toward enemies, even the secret motives of his soul. Have you ever dared to ask yourself not only what you have done, but why you have done it? "If I have denied justice to any of my servants," Job said, "what will I do when God confronts me?" He remembered the humanity of all, that the same God formed both master and servant in the womb. He declared that he had cared for the poor, clothed the naked, fed the orphans, welcomed the stranger into his home. "If I have raised my hand against the fatherless, knowing that I had influence in court, then let my arm fall from the shoulder, let it be broken off at the joint." Job's fear of God was not mere superstition. It was a living reverence that shaped every word, every action, every private thought. He examined his relationship with wealth, proclaiming he had never trusted in gold, never rejoiced in his great possessions. He examined his heart toward idolatry, swearing he had never kissed his hand in secret worship of the sun or the moon, never given his soul to false gods. Have you ever considered that true faith is tested not only by our deeds, but by the hidden allegiances of our hearts? Job even considered his treatment of enemies. He confessed that he had never rejoiced at their misfortune, never cursed them in anger. He lived in such integrity that even his household testified to his generosity. "If my land cries out against me," he said, "and all its furrows are wet with tears, if I have devoured its yield without payment or broken the spirit of its tenants, then let briars come up instead of wheat and stinkweed instead of barley." Job ended with a final solemn mark. The words of Job are ended. He had said all he could say. He had laid his life open before God, not to demand vindication from men, but to entrust his integrity to the only judge who matters. In the ashes, in the silence, Job had built an altar of honesty, an altar that no accusation could destroy, and heaven, still quiet, was about to answer. Elihu enters. A new voice rises. The book of Job, chapter 32. For long chapters, the three friends of Job had spoken, accusing, reasoning, failing to bring light into the darkness. Job, in turn, had defended himself fiercely, laying bare his wounds before heaven. And then, into the exhausted silence, a new voice rose. Elihu, son of Barachel the Buzite, a young man whose heart had burned while the elders debated, could remain silent no longer. He had listened patiently, out of respect for the wisdom that age is supposed to bring. But what he heard, from Job and from his friends, kindled a fire within him. "I am young in years," Elihu began, "and you are old. That is why I was fearful, not daring to tell you what I know. Have you ever felt truth burning within you, held back only by fear of those more seasoned in years or words?" Elihu acknowledged that wisdom should come with age, but he also declared a deeper truth. The Spirit in a person, the breath of the Almighty, gives them understanding. It is not merely age that brings wisdom, but the breath of God Himself. With boldness, Elihu turned first against Job's friends. "I waited while you spoke," he said. "I listened to your reasoning. While you were searching for words, I gave you my full attention." But they had failed. None had refuted Job. None had truly defended the justice of God. "I will have my say too," Elihu declared. "I will tell what I know." Yet Elihu's anger was not directed only at the friends. It also burned against Job. He had heard Job justify himself rather than God, heard him defend his own righteousness without bowing before the mysteries of divine sovereignty. Have you ever seen the danger not only of accusation, but also of self-righteousness taking root in wounded hearts? Elihu spoke not from a place of arrogance, but from deep conviction. He did not claim superior wisdom. He claimed urgency, a heart stirred by the Spirit to speak what others had left unsaid. "I am full of words," he confessed, "and the Spirit within me compels me. Inside I am like bottled-up wine, like new wineskins ready to burst." Elihu was not seeking applause. He was not driven by ego. He longed for truth to be heard, for both Job and his friends to see beyond their narrow arguments into the vastness of God's ways. Thus, the stage shifted. The old voices fell silent. A new voice, charged with the passion of youth and the urgency of revelation, prepared to speak. And though imperfect, Elihu's words would become a bridge, leading Job not back to self-defense nor to despair, but toward an encounter with the Almighty Himself. The answers Job longed for were near, and heaven was drawing closer. God speaks in many ways. Elihu's first speech, the book of Job, chapter 33. With the burden of truth pressing against his heart, Elihu began to speak, not with the condescension of the older friends, but with urgency and reverence. "Listen to my words, Job. Pay attention to everything I say." He approached Job not as an enemy, but as one who longed for understanding to prevail. "I am the same as you in God's sight," Elihu said. "I too am a piece of clay." He did not pretend to be superior. He acknowledged his humanity, his frailty, but he also believed that the Spirit of God had given him something essential to say. Have you ever sensed that sometimes the answer we seek comes not from power, but from humility speaking through unexpected voices? Elihu challenged Job gently yet firmly. "You have said in my hearing," he recalled, "I am pure, I have done no wrong." Yet Elihu warned that clinging to innocence without recognizing God's purposes could blind one to the greater reality at work. Then Elihu unfolded a powerful truth, that God speaks, and not always in the ways we expect. For God does speak, now one way, now another, though no one perceives it. He described how God may speak through dreams and visions, through whispers in the night that stir the sleeping soul, warning, guiding, turning a person from pride and ruin. He spoke of suffering not as random cruelty, but as divine mercy, a rod to correct, a means to preserve life from the pit. Have you ever looked back and realized that your greatest lessons came not through comfort, but through the wounds that taught you to seek Him more deeply? Elihu painted a picture of a God who does not delight in destruction, but who, even through pain, calls His children back to life. "If there is an angel at their side," he said, "a messenger, one out of 1,000, sent to tell them how to be upright, and God is gracious to them and says, 'Spare them from going down to the pit. I have found a ransom for them.' Then their flesh is renewed like a child's, they are restored as in the days of their youth." Elihu glimpsed a truth Job desperately needed to hear, that God was not Job's enemy, but his Redeemer. that even the silence, even the suffering, could be the voice of a father pursuing restoration. Have you ever dared to believe that suffering might be an invitation, not to despair, but to deeper redemption? Elihu closed his first speech with an invitation, not a demand, but a plea. Be silent, Job, and I will speak. If you have anything to say, answer me. Speak up, for I want to vindicate you. But if not, then listen to me. Be silent, and I will teach you wisdom. A new current of hope stirred in the ashes. Not cheap hope that dismissed pain, but deep hope rooted in the mystery of a God who speaks not only through blessings, but through brokenness. And Job, battered, bewildered, yearning, was closer now than he had ever been to the answer he could not yet see. Justice belongs to God alone. The Book of Job, chapter 34. Having called Job to listen, Elihu lifted his voice again, this time to defend something precious, the justice of God. You who are wise, he began, hear my words. He appealed not to pride, but to the hunger for truth that lives within every heart longing for understanding. Far be it from God to do evil, Elihu declared, from the Almighty to do wrong. Have you ever struggled to reconcile the suffering of the innocent with the goodness of an invisible God? Elihu did not deny that injustice stalks the earth. He did not pretend that evil acts go unseen. But he proclaimed that God himself is not the author of wickedness, nor the accomplice of evil. Rather, he repays everyone for what they have done. He brings on them what their conduct deserves. In God's court, no bribe can sway judgment, no shadow can conceal sin, no prestige can purchase favor. Elihu envisioned the justice of the Almighty as something pure and incorruptible, standing far above human courts, far beyond the reach of earthly manipulation. Can someone who hates justice govern? He asked. Will you condemn the just and mighty one? If even earthly kings demand integrity in judgment, how much more the king who fashioned both princes and peasants alike? Elihu reminded his listeners that God sees everything. There is no deep shadow, no utter darkness where evildoers can hide. He sees the secret acts, the hidden motives, the silent oppressions no court ever addresses. Have you ever found comfort in knowing that even the unseen injustices of your life are not invisible to heaven? God does not need long investigations. He needs no jury, no appeals. He brings down rulers without warning. He upends the mighty who abuse their power. He defends the orphan, the widow, the stranger. Elihu's vision was fierce, a God who upholds righteousness with unshakable hand, a God who cannot be accused of wrongdoing even when his ways surpass human understanding. Yet even in his fervor, Elihu left space for mystery. God does not give an account of all his actions to men. He acts according to his wisdom, not our demands. And thus, the call is not to judge God, but to trust him, to know that though justice may seem delayed, it is never denied. Even when the night feels endless, even when the oppressor thrives for a season, the judge of all the earth remains unshaken, and his justice, when it comes, will be pure, final, and true. Beyond human understanding, God is greater. The Book of Job, chapter 35. Elihu, burning with urgency and reverence, lifted his voice again, not to accuse, but to expand Job's vision beyond human limits. Do you think this is just? He asked Job. You say, I am in the right, not God. Job, in the agony of his suffering, had slipped dangerously close to implying that God's silence meant God's injustice. Have you ever found yourself questioning the goodness of God when heaven seemed too silent for too long? Elihu responded with a humbling truth. Look up to the heavens and see. Gaze at the clouds so high above you. The heavens remain untouched by human hands. Whether mankind sins or lives in righteousness, God's essence is not diminished. His majesty is not altered. If you sin, how does that affect him? If your sins are many, what does that do to him? If you are righteous, what do you give to him? Or what does he receive from your hand? God is not dependent on human behavior. His glory does not rise and fall with the tides of human virtue or rebellion. Have you ever realized that God's greatness is rooted not in our performance, but in his eternal, unchanging perfection. Elihu made it clear, our actions impact humanity, but they do not manipulate God. They do not compel him to act or to feel as we do. He described how people cry out under oppression, how they groan beneath injustice, and yet often fail to lift their eyes beyond their suffering to seek the presence of the one who gives songs in the night. Elihu warned that selfish cries for rescue without true repentance or awe are often met with silence, not because God is unjust, but because he desires hearts that seek him, not just his deliverance. Have you ever cried out to God only for relief and missed the invitation to know his heart more deeply? Elihu was not dismissing human suffering. He was lifting Job's eyes higher, reminding him and us that God's ways are not dictated by human urgency. The Almighty is greater than human injustice, greater than human complaints, greater even than human pain. And when we cannot see his hand, we are called to trust his heart. Even when clouds obscure the sun still shines beyond the veil. Even when heaven seems silent, God remains the sovereign Lord, working purposes that human minds cannot yet comprehend. God's purpose in suffering. The book of Job, chapter 36. Elihu, still burning with a passion to defend the greatness of God, lifted his voice once more. "Bear with me a little longer," he said, "and I will show you that there is more to be said on God's behalf." With reverence, Elihu declared that he spoke not from pride, but from the truth of who God is, a truth bigger than Job's pain and bigger than human explanations. "God is mighty," Elihu proclaimed, "but despises no one. He is mighty and firm in his purpose." Have you ever realized that true greatness is revealed not in crushing others, but in lifting them up with strength and compassion? Elihu described a God who watches over the afflicted, a God who uses suffering not as punishment, but as a tool of grace. He makes them listen to correction, Elihu said, and commands them to repent of their evil. In the furnace of affliction, God whispers invitations, calls to turn, calls to live, calls to find a beauty deeper than temporary ease. If they obey and serve him, Elihu continued, they will spend the rest of their days in prosperity and their years in contentment. But if they resist, if they harden their hearts against the lessons of suffering, they will perish without knowledge, missing the redemption that could have been theirs. Have you ever discovered that your deepest wounds carried within them the seeds of your greatest healing? Elihu did not promise an easy life. He offered something greater, a vision of suffering redeemed, of trials that lead not to destruction, but to transformation. He portrayed God not as a distant judge, but as a near and patient teacher, guiding the willing heart toward restoration and renewal. God is exalted in his power, Elihu declared. Who is a teacher like him? The storms that terrify us, the seasons of silence, the nights when prayers seem unanswered, all are woven into a larger story where the goodness of God is not absent, but hidden beneath layers we are not yet ready to unfold. Elihu's voice was building toward something, not condemnation, not easy answers, but awe. The awe of a soul awakening to the majesty and mercy of a God who wastes nothing, who redeems even the ashes. And soon, the one Job had longed to hear would answer from the whirlwind himself, the majesty of God in creation. The book of Job, chapter 37. As Elihu spoke, his words began to rise like a storm, capturing the grandeur of a God whose fingerprints are carved across the skies. "Listen," he said. "Listen to the roar of his voice, to the rumbling that comes from his mouth." God's voice, Elihu declared, was not limited to whispers in the heart. It echoed in the thunder, it blazed in the lightning, it trembled across the earth with irresistible power. Have you ever stood beneath a raging sky, watching storms break with unrelenting force, and felt your soul shrink in awe? Elihu described how God unleashes his lightning under the whole heaven, how he sends the snow and the rain in their seasons, how he commands the whirlwind to swirl and scatter the clouds, every gust of wind, every bolt of fire from the heavens. every drifting flake of snow, all move at the breath of his command. Elihu called Job, and all who suffer, to see that creation itself testifies to a God who is not small, who is not bound by human demands. God's voice thunders in marvelous ways, Elihu said. He does great things beyond our understanding. And have you ever considered that the storms in your life might carry the echoes of a God who is closer than the chaos suggests? Elihu spoke of a God who stops all human labor with snow, who seals up the hands of every man, forcing them to pause, to watch, to listen. In the silence that follows the fury, in the stillness after the tempest, the soul finds room to remember, this world is not in human hands. He brings the clouds to punish people or to water his earth and show his love, Elihu declared. God's purposes in nature, like his purposes in suffering, are deeper and more layered than the eye can see. Some storms bring judgment, some bring blessing. All declare his sovereignty. Have you ever surrendered your questions long enough to simply stand in awe of his greatness? Elihu ended not with condemnation, but with invitation. Stop and consider God's wonders. Look at the skies. Look at the trembling earth. Look at the dance of storms across the horizon. And remember, the God who commands the thunder is the same God who hears your whispered prayers. Creation is not chaotic, it is symphonic. Every rumble of thunder, every flash of lightning, a note in the eternal song of his glory. And soon, Job would hear that voice not in theory, but in reality, as the Almighty himself prepared to answer from the storm. The voice from the whirlwind. God questions Job. The book of Job, chapter 38. Then, out of the silence, out of the gathering storm, came the answer Job had longed for and feared. The Lord spoke to Job out of the whirlwind. "Who is this," God asked, "that obscures my plans with words without knowledge?" The voice of the Almighty did not come as gentle explanation. It came as overwhelming presence, thunderous, undeniable, unanswerable. "Brace yourself like a man," God said. "I will question you, and you shall answer me." Have you ever cried out for answers, only to find that God responds not by explaining himself, but by revealing your smallness and his glory? God took Job on a journey beyond human sight, to the foundations of the earth, to the boundaries of the seas, to the storehouses of snow and the pathways of lightning. "Where were you," God asked, "when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand." He spoke of morning stars singing together, of seas bursting forth from the womb of the deep, of light and darkness dancing at his command. Job, who had dared to question the silence, was now faced with the reality that he had never truly grasped the greatness of the one he challenged. Have you ever been humbled by realizing that your questions, though honest, are far too small for the vastness of his ways? God's voice moved through creation, through the gates of death, the corridors of the deep, the reaches of the constellations. "Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades?" he asked. "Can you loosen Orion's belt?" The questions fell like waves, each one stripping away human pride, each one unveiling a cosmos pulsing with God's craftsmanship. "Do you send the lightning bolts on their way? Do they report to you, 'Here we are'?" He spoke of lions hunting their prey, of mountain goats giving birth in secret places, of the wild donkey roaming free, of the eagle soaring high above the cliffs. Every creature, every season, every force of nature bowed not to randomness, but to the wisdom and sovereignty of the Creator. Job had pleaded for an audience with God. Now he stood before the whirlwind, and all he could do was listen. Because sometimes the answer we seek is not an explanation, but an encounter that leaves us changed, stripped of illusions, filled with awe. The storm that had seemed like destruction was in fact the doorway to revelation, and Job, broken and trembling, was finally seeing not just the gifts of God, but the God of the gifts himself, the wonders of the living world. The book of Job, chapter 39. The whirlwind still roared, But now the voice of God moved from the vastness of the heavens to the mysteries of the living world below. "Do you know when the mountain goats give birth?" God asked. "Do you watch when the doe bears her fawn?" The Creator drew Job's attention away from human courts, away from theories and arguments, to the silent miracles woven into creation itself. Have you ever stopped long enough to realize that life is unfolding all around you, guided by a hand you cannot see? God spoke of the wild donkey, untamed and free, who laughs at the clamor of the town, who roams the wastelands as his home. He spoke of the wild ox, mighty and strong, yet beyond the control of men. "Will the wild ox consent to serve you?" he asked. "Will it stay by your manger at night?" Each question humbled Job further. Each example lifted his eyes beyond his suffering to the orchestration of a world not governed by human wisdom, but by divine sovereignty. God described the ostrich, a creature that leaves her eggs on the ground, seemingly careless, yet by his design, she thrives. Have you ever wondered why God created creatures so varied, so strange, so free, and realized that mystery itself is part of the music of creation? "The horse," he said, "charges into battle with fierce pride, its snorting a terrifying sound. Strength and courage flow through its veins, but not by the command of man." "Do you give the horse its strength?" God asked. He spoke of the hawk soaring high at his command, of the eagle building its nest on the heights, surveying the earth with piercing eyes. Creation is not chaos. It is not random. It is wild beauty, woven by hands unseen, yet infinitely wise. The living world, from the smallest fawn to the mightiest eagle, moves according to patterns and purposes too deep for human understanding. Have you ever dared to trust that the same God who governs creatures beyond comprehension also holds your life in his sovereign care? Through every description, through every wonder, God was teaching Job a truth larger than his pain. That trust is not built on having all the answers, but on seeing enough of God's wisdom to bow in worship even amid the unknown. The living world pulsed with mysteries, and the one who designed them was now speaking directly to Job's heart. The challenge to Job, "Will you discredit my justice?" The book of Job, chapter 40. The whirlwind still howled, but now the voice of God pierced even deeper, straight to the core of Job's anguish. The Lord said to Job, "Will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him." Job, who had longed for a hearing with God, now stood trembling before a judge whose wisdom and power dwarfed every human complaint. "I am unworthy," Job whispered. "How can I reply to you?" I put my hand over my mouth. Have you ever realized mid-argument that what you needed was not a defense, but surrender? God was not seeking to shame Job. He was leading him into a deeper encounter, an encounter that could only begin once Job let go of his demand for control. Then the Lord spoke again out of the storm. "Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself?" God challenged the very heart of human pride, the impulse to believe that if we suffer without understanding, then God must be unjust. "Do you have an arm like God's?" he asked, "and can your voice thunder like his?" If Job could not even comprehend the foundations of creation, how could he presume to judge the Creator's justice? Have you ever wrestled with the temptation to put God on trial based on the evidence of your pain? Then, to anchor the lesson in the tangible world, God pointed to Behemoth, a living monument to his creative power. "Look at Behemoth, which I made along with you," God said. The behemoth, a creature of immense strength, powerful muscles rippling beneath thick skin, able to withstand the raging rivers, fearless even as waters surge against him. Its strength was unmatched, yet it moved not in rebellion, but according to the order God had designed. Some have speculated about Behemoth's identity, a hippopotamus, a mythical beast, a symbol of primal power. But the message was clear. There are forces in creation beyond human control, beyond human taming. And yet, they are not beyond God. Have you ever seen something so wild, so powerful, that it reminded you how small you truly are before the architect of all things? Through Behemoth, God was reminding Job, if you cannot govern even the beasts of the earth, how can you claim authority to question the ways of heaven? The storm was not just outside Job now. It was inside, tearing down every false structure, every illusion of control. And in the ruins, a new kind of worship was beginning to rise. Not the worship of a God understood, but the worship of a God trusted. The Leviathan, a glimpse of untamable power. The Book of Job, chapter 41. The whirlwind still thundered, and God continued to unveil mysteries beyond human strength. Now he spoke of Leviathan, a creature so fierce, so untamable, that no man dared approach it. Can you pull in Leviathan with a fishhook, God asked, or tie down its tongue with a rope? Leviathan, a beast of the sea, cloaked in scales like armor, its snorting sending flashes of light, its breath setting coals ablaze. Men recoiled at the very sight of it. Weapons bounced off its hide like straw. No spear, no sword, no dart could bring it down. Have you ever faced something so overwhelming that your strength and strategy seemed like nothing in its presence? God described Leviathan not as a mistake, nor as a threat outside his control, but as a part of his creation, fearsome, majestic, untouchable. Its chest was like a shield, its mouth was a ring of terror, its movements churned the deep into a boiling cauldron. Its wake left the sea shining like silver in the sun. Nothing on earth is its equal, God said. A creature without fear. Leviathan looked down on all that is haughty. It reigned over the proud. Have you ever considered that the very forces humanity fears most, chaos, death, the unknown, bow before the one who made them? In Leviathan, Job was confronted with the reality that there are powers far beyond human dominion, and yet none beyond God's reign. The chaos that seems uncontrollable to us is utterly subject to his sovereign hand. God was not merely boasting about creatures of the sea. He was reminding Job and us that the visible world is only a fraction of the realities God holds in his grasp. Storms, beasts, darkness, fearsome powers, they are wild to us. But to God, they are part of a masterpiece woven with infinite wisdom. And if he governs even the Leviathan, how much more can he be trusted to govern the unseen battles of the human soul? In the thunder, in the fire, in the shadows of mystery, God was not distant. He was revealing his greatness and calling Job into a trust deeper than understanding. The restoration, Job sees, repents, and is blessed. The Book of Job, chapter 42. Then, after the whirlwind, after the storm of questions, after the stripping away of every false foundation, Job finally spoke. I know that you can do all things, he said. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. The man who had once demanded answers now bowed before the mystery of a God whose wisdom and power he could no longer deny. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Job confessed, surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. Have you ever reached a place where surrender was more powerful than all the answers you once demanded? Job continued, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. It was not guilt for hidden sins that broke Job's heart. It was the breathtaking revelation of the God he had spoken of so many times, but never truly encountered until now. Therefore, I despise myself, Job said, and repent in dust and ashes. It was the repentance not of a man caught in secret sin, but of a soul overwhelmed by the grandeur and holiness of God. And then heaven moved. The Lord rebuked Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, for speaking wrongly about him. They had offered explanations without understanding, judgments without compassion. God commanded them to bring sacrifices and told them that Job would pray for them. Imagine the beauty of that moment. The man they had wounded, the man they had accused, was now their intercessor. Have you ever seen how God can turn even betrayal and brokenness into a stage for grace? Job prayed for his friends, and in that act of forgiveness, something shifted in the heavens. The Lord restored Job's fortunes, giving him twice as much as he had before. His brothers and sisters and all who had known him came to his house. They comforted him, they honored him, they brought gifts of silver and gold. God blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the former. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and his daughters were the most beautiful women in all the land. Job lived 140 years, long enough to see his children and their children to the 4th generation, and he died, an old man full of days. But the greatest blessing Job received was not measured in herds or wealth, not even in the smiles of restored family. It was this: he had seen God, not just in theory, not just in tradition, but face to face, heart to heart, and that vision had changed everything. The story that began in ashes ended in glory, not because all the questions were answered, but because the one who holds the answers had drawn near. The story of Job is not simply a story of suffering, it is a story of sight, of a man who lost everything and gained something no loss could ever steal. Job teaches us that real faith is not built on explanations, but on encounters, not on easy answers, but on enduring awe. He shows us that when all the blessings are stripped away, when the noise falls silent, when the dust rises from the ruins of our expectations, what remains is the God who has never changed, the God who speaks from the whirlwind, the God who commands the storms, the God who invites broken men and women to trust him even when nothing makes sense. Job's journey reminds us, restoration is not the reward for perfection. It is the gift given to those who dare to trust when there are no guarantees. His legacy calls out across the centuries, to those crushed by losses they cannot explain, to those walking through silent nights, to those waiting at the threshold of unanswered prayers. It calls with a simple, trembling truth: God is enough. Even when everything else fades, even when the answers never come, even when life does not turn out the way we dreamed, God is enough. And those who cling to him, even with the smallest thread of faith, will find that when the final pages are written, it was never about what they lost, but about the one they found. The God whose whisper moves mountains, the God whose breath stirs galaxies, the God who even now is nearer than the storm. And one day, when all the dust settles, when every tear is wiped away, when every broken heart is finally mended, we too will say with Job, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you."